In the cold shadow of a Seoul high-rise, Kong-dae discarded his fiancée with one ruthless signature, blind to her trembling protective hand. Now, the kingpin's world shatters. The woman he cast aside is serving his enemies, visibly pregnant with his only heir. The legal office of the Iron Lotus was a temple of glass and steel, designed to make anyone who entered feel small. Kong-dae sat at the head of the mahogany table, his posture as rigid as the skyline of Gangnam visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. To his father, the chairman, and the elders of the syndicate, this room was where destiny was forged. To Kong-dae, it was simply where liabilities were erased. Across from him sat Min-ah. She didn't look broken or angry. Instead, she possessed a settled, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind that comes from facing a storm alone long before it actually makes landfall. The air in the room was heavy, drained of warmth by the pale afternoon light. A lawyer with a voice like polished stone read through the terms of the annulment. Words like confidentiality, settlement, and non-disclosure floated through the space, sounding both formal and hollow. Kong-dae listened with clinical detachment, ensuring the agreement protected the Iron Lotus's reputation and his own absolute control. To him, the signature he was about to provide was not a betrayal. It was a necessary adjustment to maintain the strength of his glass fortress. The elders demanded a steel queen from a rival family, and Min-ah, the daughter of a disgraced academic, was a variable that no longer fit the equation. When the document was placed before him, Kong-dae signed his name with a fluid, practiced motion. He did not look at Min-ah as he did it. His mind was already moving toward the next border dispute and the next board meeting. Power, he had been taught, did not pause for sentiment. However, when it was Min-ah's turn, her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the pen. It wasn't fear of the man across from her. It was the weight of a secret she was determined to carry out of that room. She signed her name with a resolve that seemed to finalize more than just a marriage. It was a vow of protection for the life she was shielding. As she stood to leave, she didn't ask for more money or offer an explanation. She simply smoothed her coat and took a grounding breath, the kind taken by someone decided on survival. She walked toward the door without looking back, leaving the generous settlement check untouched on the floor. Kong-dae watched the door close with a soft, controlled sound. He told himself this was the efficiency his world demanded. He did not yet know that by discarding her, he had inadvertently placed his only heir in the path of his greatest enemies. Before we dive into the fallout of this decision, what would you do if you realized your clean break was actually your biggest mistake? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for the next twist. In the months following the annulment, Kong-dae retreated into the Cross Dominion, a fortress of concrete and glass where emotion was a foreign currency. He worked with feverish, surgical precision, expanding the Iron Lotus into shipping territories that had been contested for decades. To the outside world, he was the same untouchable kingpin, his face a mask of bored arrogance. He spent his nights in a high-rise apartment that smelled of expensive leather and loneliness, accompanied by Miranda, a woman who understood that their relationship was built on status rather than affection. Yet, despite the increasing numbers in his bank accounts and the bowing of his subordinates, a strange, hollow silence began to echo through his life. Every time he sat at his mahogany desk, his eyes would drift to the spot where Min-ah had left her settlement check, a piece of paper that represented the only thing in his world he couldn't actually buy. Deep in the neon-lit underbelly of the Mapo district, the world was loud, greasy, and vibrantly alive. Min-ah had reinvented herself as a ghost. She had traded her silk dresses for a heavy canvas apron and her penthouse views for a cramped studio apartment that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and rain. Working at the Blue Crane was an assault on the senses. The air was thick with the smoke of charcoal-grilled pork and the boisterous laughter of laborers. Her feet burned by the end of every double shift, and the constant motion made the morning sickness of the first trimester feel like an endless sea voyage. But as she moved between the crowded tables, She felt a freedom she had never known in the glass fortress. Here, she wasn't a beautiful asset or a trophy to be displayed. She was a woman building a sanctuary for the child who was now making his presence known with soft, rhythmic flutters against her ribs. Kangdae's discipline began to fray in subtle ways. He found himself staring at the security feeds of his own buildings, looking for a ghost. He had instructed his men not to track her, an order he told himself was born of professional mercy. But the lack of information felt like a blind spot in his security. He became shorter with his lieutenants and more distant with Miranda. He was a man who lived by the rule of need, and he couldn't understand why he felt phantom limb pain for someone he had surgically removed from his life. He convinced himself it was just the stress of the impending negotiations with the Red Tiger Syndicate, a volatile group that viewed his coldness as an invitation to war. He didn't realize that while he was protecting his borders, his heart was already being occupied by a memory. By the time Min-Ah reached her second trimester, her body had changed irrevocably. The protective hand he had been blind to in the legal office was now cradling a prominent, high round belly. She had become a favorite of the restaurant's regulars, the neighborhood elders who saw her not as a disgraced fiancée but as a brave mother-to-be. She had created a world where need meant love and community, not leverage and debt. She was tired, yes, but for the first time in years, she was safe from the sterile poison of the Iron Lotus. As we watch Min-Ah build a life out of nothing, do you think it's possible to truly hide from a man who owns the city? Share your thoughts below and subscribe as the worlds of the Kingpin and the Waitress prepare to collide. The humid Friday night air in Mapo was thick with the scent of charcoal and the aggressive neon glow of the district. Kangdae hated locations like the Blue Crane. To him, the noise was a security risk, and the lack of a private entrance was an insult. However, the Red Tiger Syndicate thrived on such grit. Their leader, a volatile man named Sang-hoon, had insisted on this neutral ground to discuss the expansion of shipping routes. Kangdae entered the restaurant like a predator entering a cage, his tailored suit creating a sharp, unnatural silhouette against the rustic wooden tables and billowing smoke. He sat with his back to the wall, eyes scanning the room with the mechanical coldness of a man who saw threats in every shadow. He was deep into a calculated argument about dock fees when the world suddenly decelerated. He heard a soft melodic hum, a sound that shouldn't have been there, a sound that belonged to a ghost. A waitress approached the table, her head bowed as she balanced a massive tray laden with steaming bowls of sundubujigi and side dishes. She moved with a rhythmic, heavy gait, her steps deliberate and careful. As she reached the table to set down the first dish, her apron pulled taut, revealing the unmistakable, high-rounded curve of a pregnancy that was well into its 6th month. Kangdae's bored arrogance vanished as if it had been stripped away by a physical blow. He looked up, expecting to see a stranger, but he met the wide, dark eyes of Min-Ah. The air in the restaurant seemed to vanish. The shouting of the Red Tiger boss, the clattering of metal chopsticks, and the sizzle of the grills all fell into a terrifying, pressurized silence. Kangdae, the man who had ordered the dismantling of entire organizations without a tremor in his voice, froze. His vision tunneled until the only thing in the universe was Min-Ah's pale face and the life she was carrying. His gaze dropped to her belly, then back to her eyes. The math was cold and undeniable. She had been carrying his child the day he forced her to sign that contract. He had discarded his own blood to satisfy a board of directors. The frozen moment felt like an eternity. Min-Ah recovered first, her face hardening into a mask of stoic defiance. Her hand trembled as she set the last bowl down, but she didn't say a word. She didn't beg and she didn't scream. She simply turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her silhouette heavy with the burden he had refused to share. Sang-hoon, the rival boss, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he watched Kangdae's uncharacteristic reaction. "Something wrong, Kangdae? You look like you've seen a dead man." Kangdae didn't answer. His hand, resting on the table, shook just enough to rattle the water in his glass. He realized in that instant that his glass fortress had no walls against this. What would you do if you were caught between your criminal reputation and the sudden realization that you've abandoned your own child? Let us know in the comments before we move to the next scene. The meeting with the Red Tigers ended in a blur of forced negotiations and hollow threats. Kongdae didn't remember signing the shipping agreement. His mind was a storm of a single image. Min-ah, heavy with his child, carrying a tray that looked far too heavy for her. As soon as he reached his SUV, the corporate kingpin vanished. He didn't go back to the glass fortress. He sat in the darkness of the back seat, watching the entrance of the blue crane until the neon lights flickered out at 2 a.m. When he saw her emerge, wrapping a thin cardigan over her bump and walking toward the subway with a visible limp, a cold, sharp rage settled in his chest. Not at her, but at the world he had built that forced her to hide in the shadows. His first instinct was the one he had been raised with: ownership. He wanted to call his elite security team, snatch her off the street, and lock her in a high-security penthouse where he could monitor her health every second. He even reached for his phone to dial his head of security. But then he remembered the look in her eyes at the table. Not fear, but a stone-cold wall of defiance. She hadn't left his money on the floor because she was proud. She had left it because she didn't want his blood money touching their child. If he forced her now, he would lose her forever. He realized he had to learn a new skill: protection without possession. The shadow campaign began the next morning. Kongdae didn't return to his office. Instead, he summoned his most trusted low-profile operative to a bridge overlooking the Han River. "I want the building adjacent to the blue crane," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Buy it through a shell company. I want the third floor converted into a surveillance hub, but no one, absolutely no one, is to know I'm there. And find out who the local street thugs are in Mapo. Pay them triple what they make to move their business 3 districts over. I want her street to be the safest place in Seoul." For the next week, Kongdae became a ghost. He watched her through high-powered lenses from the darkened windows of the neighboring building. He saw her struggle with the morning grocery deliveries. The next day, a charity suddenly donated a motorized lift to the restaurant. He saw a group of rowdy drunks harass her for a late order. An hour later, those men were visited by tax collectors, who made it clear they were never to set foot in Mapo again. He was hovering over her life like a dark, invisible sun. But the more he watched, the more he saw the peace on her face when she talked to the neighborhood Halmonis. He began to realize that his presence was the very thing that would destroy that peace. As Kongdae trades his throne for a telescope, do you believe a man can truly change his nature, or is he just waiting for the right moment to take control again? Tell us your theory in the comments and subscribe to see if his secret stays safe. While Kongdae operated from the shadows of Mapo, the glass fortress in Gangnam was beginning to crack. The Iron Lotus elders, led by his own father's former right-hand man, Elder Shin, had noticed the kingpin's frequent absences. To them, a leader who spent his nights in a gritty district like Mapo was either losing his mind or hiding a vulnerability. The pressure for Kongdae to marry the Steel Queen of the Busan Syndicate had reached a boiling point. They viewed his silence as hesitation, and in their world, hesitation was an invitation to a coup. The confrontation happened in the very boardroom where he had signed Min-ah's life away. Elder Shin stood at the window, his back to Kongdae. "The Red Tigers are talking, Kongdae," the old man said, his voice like dry parchment. "They say you froze in a common barbecue house. They say you looked at a waitress as if she held your heart in her hands. We do not pay for hearts, we pay for results." Kongdae felt a cold sweat prickle his neck, but his face remained a mask of stone. He realized that his shadow campaign was no longer a secret. By trying to protect Min-ah, he had inadvertently painted a target on her back. That night, Kongdae returned to his penthouse and found Miranda waiting. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper intuition. She didn't ask where he had been. She simply looked at the way he checked his encrypted phone every 5 minutes. "She's pregnant, isn't she?" Miranda asked, her voice devoid of jealousy, replaced instead by a clinical pity. "The one you threw away. You're trying to play the hero now, but you've forgotten one thing, Kongdae. You are the villain in her story. Your protection is just another form of a cage." Miranda's departure was swift and silent. She took her jewelry and her designer bags, leaving Kongdae alone in a space that felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. He spent the rest of the night staring at the surveillance feed from the building next to the blue crane. He watched Minna closing up the restaurant, leaning against the doorframe to rub her lower back. He wanted to run to her, to catch her before she stumbled, to tell her he was sorry. But he stayed in the dark, a prisoner of his own reputation. He knew that the moment he stepped into the light, the Red Tigers and the Iron Lotus Elders would strike. He was the poison, and she was the only thing he wanted to keep pure. As the walls close in on Kongdae, do you think he should stay a ghost or risk everything to stand by her side? Weigh in below and subscribe for the tension-filled next twist. The silence of Mapo was shattered at 3:14 a.m. by a sound Kongdae had trained himself to hear even in his sleep. Through the high-gain audio feed from his surveillance hub, he heard a sharp gasp, the sound of glass shattering, and then a low, rhythmic moan of pain that made his blood turn to ice. He didn't check the monitors. He didn't call his guards. He sprinted down the back stairs of the neighboring building, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached her doorstep just as she was trying to crawl toward her phone. The door was locked, but to the heir of the Iron Lotus, a lock was merely a suggestion. With one coordinated strike of his shoulder, the frame splintered. He was inside in seconds, dropping to his knees on the cold linoleum floor. Minna was curled on her side, clutching her stomach, her face slick with cold sweat. When she saw him, her eyes widened with a mixture of terror and agonizing relief. "Kongdae," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Something's wrong. It's too early. He's not moving." The kingpin vanished. The man who calculated dock fees and executed rivals died in that moment. In his place was a man who scooped her up with a gentleness that defied his massive frame. He ignored the non-disclosure agreements, the elders, and the Red Tigers. He carried her to his SUV, driving through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul with a desperate, controlled fury. He didn't head for a public clinic. He bypassed every red light until they reached St. Aurelius, the private medical center owned by the syndicate. As the nurses whisked her away onto a gurney, Minna reached out, her fingers catching the sleeve of his charcoal suit. "Don't leave us," she sobbed. It was the first time she had used that word, us, since the day in the lawyer's office. Kongdae stood in the sterile white hallway, his hands covered in her sweat and the dust of her apartment, feeling the crushing weight of his own helplessness. For the first time in his life, his signature couldn't fix the problem. His money couldn't buy the heartbeat of his son. He sat in the waiting room, a dark god in a temple of healing, watching the clock tick. Every minute felt like a year. He realized then that his shadow campaign had been a lie. He hadn't been protecting her. He had been hiding from the truth of his own love. Now, with both of their lives on the line, the glass fortress felt like a tomb. If you were Kongdae, would you finally admit your faults to her, or would you retreat into the shadows once the danger passed? Tell us your thoughts below and subscribe to see if the heir survives. The doors of the St. Aurelius surgical wing felt like the gates of a world Kongdae no longer understood. 4 hours he paced the private corridor, his presence terrifying the junior staff. He was a man who lived by the clock, yet time had become a distorted, agonizing crawl. Every time a doctor emerged, Kongdae's heart stopped, waiting for a verdict he couldn't influence with a bribe or a threat. The helplessness was a physical weight, a suffocating realization that all his millions and all his soldiers were useless against the biological struggle happening behind those double doors. Near dawn, a nurse finally approached him, her face softened by a tired smile. "She's stable, Mr. Kong. And your son is a fighter. He's in the NICU, but he's breathing on his own." The word son hit Kongdae with the force of a landslide. He didn't go to the recovery room first. He went to the neonatal unit. Standing behind the thick glass, he saw a tiny, red-faced infant swaddled in white. The child was impossibly small, his hands curled into miniature fists. Kongdae pressed his palm against the glass, his breath hitching. This was the variable he had almost erased. This was the liability that now felt like the only thing in the world worth keeping. For the first time, he understood why Minna had run. She wasn't hiding from his enemies. She was hiding from the version of Kongdae that would have turned this innocent life into a political chess piece. He eventually found Minna in a private suite, looking pale and fragile amidst the monitors. As he entered, her eyes snapped open, immediately searching his. "Is he?" "He's perfect," Kongdae said, his voice uncharacteristically thick. He sat in the chair beside her bed, not touching her, respecting the vast distance he had created between them. "The doctors say he's strong. Like you." Minna looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "You shouldn't be here, Kongdae. The Iron Lotus. They'll find out. They'll use him. I did everything to keep him away from that glass prison of yours." "I know," he whispered. "I was blind, Minna. I thought power was about what you could take. I didn't realize it was about what you could endure to protect." He looked at his hands, the hands that had signed the annulment. "I'm not here to take you back to the fortress. I'm here to make sure the fortress never touches you again." Their conversation was cut short by the vibration of his phone. It was a high-priority alert from his security team. Elder Shin and the Red Tiger leadership had been spotted meeting at a private club. The secret was out. The birth of the heir had turned Mapo into a battlefield, and the hospital was no longer a sanctuary. Kongdae stood up, his face hardening back into the mask of the kingpin. But this time, the eyes behind the mask were different. He wasn't fighting for territory anymore. He was fighting for a miracle. Do you think a man like Kongdae can ever truly dismantle his empire, or will his past always find a way to bleed into his future? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the high-stakes next scene. The street outside St. Aurelius was no longer a place of healing. It had become a tactical map. Kongdae stood at the window of the executive lounge, watching the black sedans circle the block with the predatory patience of sharks. Elder Shin had not come alone. He had brokered a desperate, bloody alliance with the Red Tigers. To them, a kingpin with a secret family was a kingpin who could be blackmailed, broken, and replaced. They didn't want the child for his bloodline. They wanted him as a leash. Kongdae turned to his head of security, a man who had served his father for 20 years. "Move the heavy units to the basement. I want the maternity wing sealed. If anyone without a badge or my personal clearance breathes on that floor, erase them." "Sir," the guard hesitated. "The board of directors. Your father. They're calling for a vote. If you stay here, you lose the Iron Lotus." "The Iron Lotus is a graveyard of glass," Kongdae spat, his voice cold and final. "Let them vote. I'm not leaving this room." He returned to Minara's side, but he didn't come empty-handed. He placed his encrypted laptop on her bedside table. On the screen was a series of legal documents, but they weren't annulments or NDAs. They were divestment papers. "I'm burning it down, Minna," he said quietly. "I'm liquidating my personal shares. I'm handing the shipping routes to the Red Tigers in exchange for a permanent ceasefire, and I'm stepping down from the Iron Lotus." Minna looked at him, her eyes wide with shock. "You're giving up your empire? For us?" An empire is only worth something if you have something to protect, he replied. I spent my life building walls, only to realize I was the one trapped inside. The showdown didn't happen with gunfire in the hallways but with a cold, calculated surrender in the digital world. Kongdae sent the signal. The Iron Lotus was now leaderless and fragmented, a gift to his rivals that would keep them busy fighting each other for years. He had traded his crown for their safety. He watched the black sedans slowly disperse, the vultures realizing the carcass they were circling was no longer there. He had made himself a nobody to ensure his son could be a somebody. As Kongdae walks away from his life's work, do you believe a man can truly be happy without power, or is the sacrifice too great? Leave a comment below and subscribe for the final part of the story and the ultimate resolution. 6 months later, the Mapo district had transformed from a place of hiding into a place of beginning. The morning sun filtered through the window of a modest, sun-drenched apartment, a far cry from the tinted glass of the Iron Lotus headquarters. Kongdae stood in the kitchen, carefully measuring warm water for a bottle. There were no bodyguards in the hallway, no encrypted phones buzzing with threats, and no shadows lurking in the corners. He moved with a new kind of discipline, one that wasn't born of the need to command but the need to care. Min-ah walked into the room, carrying their son, Jun-ho. The baby was thriving, his cheeks full and his eyes bright with a curiosity that Kongdae found terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. The tension that had once defined Min-ah's shoulders was gone, replaced by a soft, weary contentment. She watched Kongdae as he handed her the bottle, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the kingpin he had left behind. She found only a man who had finally learned the value of a quiet life. He looks like you when he frowns, she said softly, sitting at the small wooden table. But I think he has my heart. I hope he has everything of yours, Kongdae replied, sitting across from her. He had traded his charcoal suits for soft linens, and his hands, once used to grip weapons and sign away lives, now spent their time assembling cribs and folding laundry. He still watched the door out of habit, but the threats had faded. By dismantling his empire and handing the pieces to his rivals, he had created a chaotic equilibrium that left him too insignificant to hunt. He had achieved the ultimate Mafia victory. He had successfully vanished while staying exactly where he was needed. The afternoon was spent in the local park, a place where Kongdae was known only as Junho's father. He pushed the stroller along the path, feeling the warmth of the sun on his neck. He saw the neighborhood elders, the same ones who had protected Min-ah when he was a ghost in her life, and he bowed to them with genuine respect. He had realized that true power wasn't found in a boardroom overlooking the city. It was found in the ability to walk down a street without fear, holding the hand of the woman he had almost lost. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the Han River, Kongdae looked at Min-ah and their son. He realized that his life was no longer a glass fortress. It was something fragile and real, something that required constant tending and humble protection. He had learned that the strongest thing a man can do is let go of a throne to hold a child. He was no longer the boss of the Iron Lotus. He was a man who was finally home. After witnessing Kongdae's journey from a cold kingpin to a devoted father, do you think everyone deserves a second chance at love, or are some mistakes too big to forgive? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of redemption. The end.